Yeah, on behalf of Team LGS, it's a pleasure, privilege to welcome you again, Ashwin. Now you've taken upon yourself bringing some high quality lecture series in the renal liver transplantation, much appreciated. And I welcome the other speakers of Vasant and um,
Chandan.
Chandan.
He's
Yeah,
also here, sir.
I could see him there. Yeah. Over to you, Ashwin.
Okay, sir. Thank you, Dr. Pattad. It's been an honor to host the whole series. To start off, welcome once again to another session of the liver transplantation series on the LGS forum. From a highly charged session last week on transplant oncology, let's move on to something more urgent with regards to indications for a liver transplantation. Now, we all know there are certain pathologies which affect the liver so acutely that its function falls below what can sustain life. Unfortunately, unlike, say, the kidney, there isn't an effective proven dialysis to bridge the state till the liver regenerates or recovers from this insult. Sometimes leaving liver transplantation is the only option to save the patient's life. Now, this condition has varied outcomes with varied etiologies, especially in the context of the Indian subcontinent, which is quite different from that of the West. In these fragile patients, the decision when to operate and when not to is quite a difficult one, especially in the LDLT setting. To speak to us about all this is our first speaker, Dr. Vasant Kumar. He's a transplant surgeon with our team, and he did his basic and higher surgical training in India, followed by a fellowship under Professor Ella. He has been an integral member of the team. He's been with us for the last 4 years. He has a special interest in hepatic venous outflow obstruction and neuroendocrine tumors, and is one of the rising stars of Prof's unit. Vasant used to be an avid hockey player, and like in the game, while operating as well, he's a total team player who can be depended upon to hit the mark every time. Another pathology which is not akin to our usual chronic liver disease, neither is it acute liver failure, but lies somewhere in a gray area in between. Now, the outcomes of this acute on liver failure is much worse than both, and has variable definitions and is a topic of active debate among hepatology circles. This again should not be confused with acute decompensation in a CLD patient. And management of this cohort of these fragile patients again in the pre-transplant setting is difficult, and so it is after transplantation as well. To speak to us about this is our next speaker, which is Dr. Chandan Kumar. He heads the hepatology unit at Gleneagles Global Hospital, Hyderabad. Chandan did his hepatology training from ILBS, followed by short fellowships at Mount Sinai and King's College. An avid academic with over 50 publications, Chandan was the professor of hepatology at SRMC and has numerous publications on this topic with Professor Sarin. Now, but for now, let's hear it from Dr. Vasant. You can share your screen and your slides, Vasant, and you're good to go.
Thank you, Dr. Ashwin, and thank you, Dr. Radhakrishnan. Can you see it? Dr. Ashwin?
No, we still can't see your slides, but if you have started sharing it, there might be a slight lag.
I've started sharing.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thanks, Dr. Ashwin, and thanks, Dr. Radhakrishnan. Today, the first topic is for this evening is liver transplantation and acute liver failure. Liver transplantation and acute failure has been a paramount importance in acute liver failure since 1980s. The survival prior to transplantation era in acute liver failure was less than 15%. ALF has gone through multiple names and diagnostic criteria over the past 47 years. So let's see the brief journey of acute liver failure till now. First of all, we are going to see the definition, etiology, pathogenesis, the clinical spectrum of ALF, and the management protocols, the prognostic models in choosing the patient for liver transplantation, and some few special mentions at the end. Acute liver failure is a clinical syndrome rather than a disease. What is the difference between an acute liver injury and an acute liver failure? The most important thing is the encephalopathy. Presence of encephalopathy without underlying liver disease is the definition of ALF. Whereas the acute liver injury is coagulopathy, no encephalopathy, with or without underlying liver disease. There has been numerous publications on what is the best definition for acute liver failure. So this is the most widely followed definition. Severe hepatic dysfunction with coagulopathy, INR, that is INR more than 1.5, and at any degree of encephalopathy in the absence of chronic liver disease within 26 weeks of onset of illness. This is the most commonly used definition. To subclassify acute liver failure, the most commonly used is the O'Grady system, which subclassifies into hyperacute, acute, and subacute. Why to subclassify? It has its prognostic significance distinct from the cause of illness. So in patients with hyperacute disease, there is a better prognosis. For example, with paracetamol overdosing or ischemic hepatopathy, they have a good initial recovery rate. Whereas in subacute group, there is a less common encephalopathy, moderate hepatic dysfunction. But once hepatic encephalopathy develops, these patients have very low chance of survival without transplant. Coming to the burden of the disease, you can see the paradigm shift from the Western countries to the Eastern and South Asian countries. In the West, paracetamol overdose is the toxicity is the most common cause for ALF. Whereas in Japan and India, hepatitis is the most common. And in Japan, hepatitis B virus, and in India, hepatitis E virus is the most common. The etiology, hepatic viral etiology, the drugs, the toxins, mushroom poisoning, others, indeterminate etiology, pregnancy-related etiologies, and vascular-related etiologies. Coming to the drugs, paracetamol overdose is dose-dependent. A very high dose of greater than 10 grams per day can lead to acute liver failure. It presents with high aminotransferase levels and low bilirubin. But in case if you see the other drugs, they are very rarely dose-related. The toxicity is very rarely dose-related. And anti-tuberculous drugs is the most common cause for a drug-induced liver injury in India. Hepatitis E is most common in India. And we should keep in our mind that reactivation of chronic or inactive hepatitis B can occur in the setting of chemotherapy or immunosuppression. The less common viral diseases are HSV, CMV, and dengue viruses. And majority of the indeterminate patients are autoimmune patients. It can go up to 30%. Steroid therapy is in the early stage is very important. And in case if the etiology is not identifiable, liver biopsy is indicated. In young patients, if a young patient with an abrupt onset of Coombs negative hemolytic anemia with the serum bilirubin levels higher than 20, those patients can be diagnosed with Wilson's disease. And fulminant type Wilson's disease has high fatality, which can cause high mortality in these patients, and a prompt consideration of transplantation should be included. Coming to the pathology, all the etiologies can lead to liver injury, and with necrosis and apoptosis leads to massive hepatocyte death and cell dropout, which is more than the regeneration. It leads to acute liver failure, and there is decreased function and decreased metabolism based on the liver functions. There is an increased inflammatory reaction which leads to systemic inflammatory response syndrome and multi-organ dysfunction. And finally, death. If you come to the natural clinical spectrum of the disease, significant proportion of ALF patients can regenerate their hepatocyte mass provided they survive long enough for regeneration. But the time scale is unknown. Hyperacute disease has preserved scaffolding of the survival hepatocytes and stem cells quickly repopulate. So there is an increased chance of recovery. Whereas in subacute liver failure, the reticulum framework is completely collapsed. So the recovery might be delayed. So there are 4 possibilities. Majority, since viral hepatitis is more common, I'm showing this, the majority of viral hepatitis patients will recover. Many patients go into encephalopathy where they spontaneously recover. And if the hepatocyte liver function reserve is less, like 15%, there is no recovery without liver transplantation. If it's still there is a complete dropout of cells, the patients might have multi-organ dysfunction and death. The clinical spectrum of the disease involves all the organs. The first most important thing is the cerebral edema and the intracranial hypertension. Hyperammonia due to severe hepatic dysfunction causes osmotic disturbances, which leads to cerebral edema and intracranial hypertension. These are recognized as the most common. They relate to severe hepatic encephalopathy. Long-term neurological deficits are seen in acute liver failure, and uncal herniation should be considered whenever the patient deteriorates because it's uniformly fatal. Infection is the next most important common complication, and bacterial infection can be seen in 35 to 50% of patients. SIRS, along with infection and progression to deeper stage of encephalopathy, has a mortality of up to 60%. Renal failure has poor prognosis, and metabolic disturbances like hypoglycemia and electrolyte disturbances are more common. Coming to the investigations are tailored to assess the disease severity and determine the etiology and see for the complication and prognosis of the disease. Acute pancreatitis should be ruled out, and if there is a cerebral edema, if the signs of intracranial hypertension, CT brain should be done immediately. To assess the disease severity, arterial ammonia and lactate levels are seen to prognosticate the patient for liver transplantation. What is the role of liver biopsy in acute liver failure? The role is very limited, and it should be performed preferably by a transnuclear route in a center experienced. It helps us determine the underlying chronic liver disease, malignancies, or alcohol-induced liver injury. A rapid implementation of specific therapy may alter the clinical course of ALF in certain etiologies. So, institution of N-acetylcysteine immediately for a paracetamol overdose and nucleotide analogs for HPV infection or HPV reactivation, and delivery of fetus for pregnancy-related therapies helps in tide over the clinical crisis in acute liver failure. The important do's and don'ts in acute liver failure ICU management. At the sign of any degree of altered sensorium, the patient should be admitted, and they should be admitted in the ICU. Early referral to the tertiary care center is advised. Avoidance of fluid and electrolyte imbalance is paramount. Hypertonic saline is used to keep sodium level between 140 to 150. If there is worsening sensorium and grade 3, grade 4 encephalopathy, the patient should be ventilated mechanically. At the onset of signs of intracranial hypertension, hypertonic saline or mannitol should be used, and prophylactic use is not recommended. Non-invasive assessment of intracranial hypertension can be useful, and invasive methods are not indicated in our country. Even though there is derangement of PT and INR in acute liver failure, prophylactic correction is not recommended, and it reduces the prognostication of the patient. Active bleeding and planned invasive procedure are the 2 indications where it should be corrected. For the renal failure patients, early institution of continued renal replacement therapy is important. Early enteral feeding is paramount for patients in ICU, and all patients should be started on NAC. The second part of the presentation is when to decide on transplantation. It is critical to quickly and accurately identify patients who will be benefited by emergency liver transplant. And it is crucial to have reliable predictive markers. In general, if you see increased grade of hepatic encephalopathy, and when there is increasing bilirubin and INR associated with AKI, the patients have poor prognostic factors. Various prognosticating systems are available, but they all fail to achieve success. You can see the most commonly or widely used criteria is the King's College criteria. The next most common is the Cliche criteria. We should see the sensitivity and specificity of the prognostic scores. The recent ones are Apache, sequential organ failure assessment score, MELD score, acute liver failure score, study group prognosticating index. These are the recent scores, but none of the scores have been validated perfectly for prognostication the patient for liver transplant in acute liver failure. So coming to which is the best prognostic models, King's College criteria is time tested and it is the most widely validated prognostic model. It is mostly validated in the West. In Southeast Asia, the etiology is heterogeneous and clinical spectrum of ALF is quite different, but it still holds good with the preserved specificity even if the sensitivity is low. The next most common is the Paul Bruce criteria or Cliche criteria, where factor 5 and hepatic encephalopathy is used as cofactors. The recent one is acute liver failure early dynamic model, which includes the hepatic encephalopathy, INR, arterial ammonia levels, and serum bilirubin. This model is very important because it is a dynamic model which can assess the patient whenever there is a clinical deterioration, but it needs validation. What is the favorable situation of liver transplant in acute liver failure patients? Hemodynamic stability with good pressure supports, less than this upper ceiling effect, a good cerebral perfusion pressure, good oxygenation, and if there is an availability of good graft. When do you call a patient too sick for transplantation? When there is evidence, these are the major criteria to say the patients are too sick for transplantation. Evidence of brainstem herniation is considered an absolute contraindication, and confirmed invasive fungal infection has poor survival in these patients. Low cardiac index and right heart failure is again a contraindication for transplantation. And hemorrhagic pancreatitis and uncontrolled ARDS are considered relative contraindications. If the patient is in sepsis, if the patient requires more than 24 hours of treatment for sepsis, then it is a relative contraindication. What are the different types of liver transplantation available in ALF? As of now, DDLT is considered best because we are giving the whole organ to the patient for rapid recovery. The problems with DDLT are the organ availability in our country. The waitlist mortality is high in cases of acute liver failure, which goes up to 30%. And since these patients are very sick, we had to accept marginal grafts for rapid transplantation. So it might reduce the long-term survival of these patients with increased postoperative morbidity. Coming to the LDLT options, it gives us a good graft quality. We have a wider window of opportunity to see if the patients can spontaneously recover. It helps us explore bridging therapies, and we always are left with a APOLT decision, axillary partial orthotopic liver transplant decision. And the concerns about LDLT are the donor morbidity and the adequate mass for tiding over the crisis of acute liver failure. The third option is ABO incompatible grafts, which should be used only in the non-availability of compatible grafts because it has increased rejection, infection, and graft loss with increased morbidity. We should have a dedicated multidisciplinary team, and the patient selection and timing of liver transplant gives us a very good outcome. Family should be counseled about the transplant prognosis and the possibility of further deterioration. Once it is decided, patient should be listed for transplant or the expedite donor evaluation should be done. In case of rapid deterioration, because of the delayed organ or unavailability of the donor, aggressive multi-organ support should be done. And anaphylaxis phase can also be considered. This is the liver in ALF. This is usually collapsed, shrunken, and stiff during transplant. Regenerative nodules can be seen specifically in patients with subacute liver failure. The important intraoperative steps to be followed during ALF management is the head-up position to improve the cerebral blood flow. Hypothermia should be avoided to avoid intractable coagulopathy intraoperatively. Early hepatic artery ligation, minimal handling till devascularization are very important to avoid toxic liver syndrome because of the release of toxins into the bloodstream. Early portocable shunt is again another important step because there is no collateral formation in these patients, and this can reduce the bowel congestion. The most important intraoperative complications, which are very challenging, are primary non-function, ischemic reperfusion injury, intractable coagulopathy, pulmonary edema, and cardiac arrest. Perioperative complications are paramount in these patients because the prolonged recovery due to long ICU stay and the ventilator dependence are expected in these patients who are sick preoperatively. Seizures, intracerebral bleeds can occur, so repeat clinical evaluation is needed, and anti-edema measures should be continued for at least 24 to 48 hours, and imaging should be done whenever is required. Sepsis is the most common cause of mortality. Bacterial and fungal and viral prophylaxis should be instituted according to the institution policy. Early institution of CRRT, if it was not already started for renal complications. Since all these patients are young patients, most of the patients are young patients getting transplanted, there is a high chance of rejection in the post-operative period. So the balance of rejection with infection is should be instituted. Psychological issues should be considered, and it should be counseled. The poor prognostic factors associated with liver transplant in ALF are age greater than 45 years, male sex, and non-viral etiology. Graft-related factors are donor greater than 60 years, ABO mismatch, and reduced liver with increased steatosis in the graft. Clinical conditions, increased vasopressor requirement, and the creatinine level of more than 2. So consideration of UPHOLD. When do you consider UPHOLD in ALF? UPHOLD should be considered when an ALF patient is listed for transplant centers with necessary expertise. Proper patient selection is very important, and it is based on the clinical status and potential for liver recovery. So it can act as a bridge to native liver regeneration. The most important thing is rapid graft recovery after adequate graft volume is given. In experienced hands, UPHOLD provides excellent early graft and patient survival, similar to orthotopic liver transplantation, and 2/3 of these patients having the chance of immunosuppression-free survival later. So this is a picture which shows, this is a paper from our unit, which shows the light lobe UPHOLD, where a right extended aptectomy is done and the right lobe is placed just before reperfusion. And this is a UPHOLD in a child, left lateral segment graft with after a left extended aptectomy. Indications are UPHOLD. It should be considered in conditions where regeneration is rapid, like paracetamol overdose, hepatitis A and hepatitis E, or toxin-related ALF. Hemodynamically unstable patients with high intracranial pressure who cannot withstand longer procedures should not be treated with by UPHOLD. So what are the lessons we have learned with acute liver failure over a period of time? This is the paper from King's Institute. They have an extensive experience with more than 3,300 patients. It says the overall survival has improved from 17 to 62%. And in a non-transplant patients, the survival has increased to 48%. In transplant patients, it has increased to 86%. There is a significant fall in intracranial hypertension related mortality because of the advanced and improved ICU strategy. Etiology and overhead hepatic encephalopathy are the independent factors considered for the outcome. But even then, the mortality is still high in ALF. Coming to the impact of liver transplantation in ALF, we can see a recent improvement in survival compared to the previous time periods. It has significantly increased. So this means, should we transplant all ALF patients? We should keep in mind about three important things. One is organ wastage, futile transplants, and there is a risk of transplant related morbidity in patients. So what are the results of LDLT for ALF? So this is the Japanese registry, which shows 209 patients, which have a significant survival of 79 patients. These are the two Indian papers we have published that have been published about LDLT, which have good survival. Comparing the survival outcomes in ALF with DDLT and LDLT, the survival outcomes are similar compared to the DDLT and LDLT outcomes. There's another paper which shows the graft and overall survival similar between DDLT and LDLT. Is there a rationale for plasma exchange in ALF? Can it bridge to transplant? So this was answered by this first randomized control trial by Larsen et al. So a high volume plasma exchange was done in these patients, and there is a impact of decreased severity of HE, hepatic encephalopathy, and vasopressor support in these patients with high volume plasma pheresis, and it is mediated by dampening innate immune response. This study shows a significant improvement in transplant-free survival in patients compared with high volume plasmapheresis to symptomatic treatment, and it improves the transplant-free survival in patients who are listed for transplant and were not transplant. The concerns about high volume plasma exchange is sepsis and the impaired level of drugs, which should be kept in mind. So a brief mention about allophosphorus poisoning. More frequently, it is seen in India than paracetamol poisoning, and there is no antidote. The toxic dose is 1 mg per kg, and there is a rapid absorption of the poison from the gastrointestinal system, which causes severe liver injury and hepatocyte cell death. Multi-organ dysfunction happens very soon, and this is the largest published study from India, which shows the effect of liver transplantation. And 14 patients underwent liver transplantation. According to the multivariate analysis, MELD, INR, and hepatic encephalopathy grade, AST, ALT, bilirubin were significant parameters for poor outcomes. And based on that, MELD greater than 36 or INR greater than 6 with HE were considered excellent predictors for liver transplantation in allophosphorus poisoning. And during workup, 18% of patients died before transplantation. So there is a high mortality in patients with allophosphorus poisoning, and dynamic assessment is very important to avoid futile transplant. The benefit of plasma exchange is not very clear. Postoperative complications should be kept in mind, and graft dysfunction can be either because of the residual toxin or rejection that should be differentiated with a biopsy. The next subset of patients is the children. What is the difference between ALF in children and adults? Severe acute liver injury with an INR of greater than 1.5 and the presence of clinically HE is defined as ALF in children, or INR of greater than 2 regardless of HE is considered acute liver failure in children. The etiology indeterminate predominates in European countries, and whereas in India viral etiology predominates. Other important etiologies which can occur specifically in children are metabolic liver disease and neonatal inborn errors of metabolism. The criteria for listing is not validated, but the most widely followed definition is INR greater than 4 and total bilirubin greater than 17.6 is the currently accepted criteria for transplantation. The outcomes are very good in transplants with ALF in children. The 15-year survival is 67%. Some mention about the future trends in ALF, the liver assist devices which can bridge to transplantation, hepatocyte transplantation, repopulation of decellularized organs, and the interest in stem cell transplantation and induced organogenesis. So the take-home message is, whenever a patient with the ALF is admitted, a general supportive measures should be taken. Etiology-specific investigations and interventions should be done. Prevention and management of complications is paramount. and a need for a possible liver transplantation should be taken early, which improves the prognosis of the patient. And with the financial clearance and social support, patient can be listed. And if it is a LDLT, expedite donor evaluation is paramount importance. And if there is a further deterioration, there should be a delisting based on the medical and the social contraindications. Thank you.
A very comprehensive talk, Vasan. Thank you for that, and thank you for keeping within the time as well. If we can have the next speaker, Dr. Chandan. Chandan, are you there?
Thank you, Ashwin.
Yeah. Hi, Chandan. If you can share your slides and then.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Is my screen visible?
No, not yet.
There's usually a lag, so
yeah, I think we had to live with it.
Is my screen visible?
Not at Chandan.
Yes. I'll just one second.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. Can make it full screen.
Yes. Thank you, Ashwin, for the kind introduction. At the outset, I first want to thank Professor Rela, Dr. Patta Radhakrishna, and my dear friend, Dr. Ashwin, for giving me this opportunity to speak in LGS Forum Transplant Series. So my topic is liver transplantation for ACLF. I have no disclosures. I have no potential conflicts of interest. So I'll be covering my talk in this different points: definition, organ failure, sepsis, decision-making, proposed algorithm, and a take-home message. So before I start the presentation, I would like to present a case. This was a case we recently had seen in our unit. He was a 40-year-old male, a local from Hyderabad, with history of alcohol consumption for more than 20 years. Last drink was 1 month back. He was brought to ER. He came to our hospital for the first time with autosensorium for 3 days duration, increased drowsiness since 2 days, distension of abdomen since 6 months, jaundice fluctuating since 5 years, worsening since 6 months, and there was no other associated bleed or any other GI symptoms. He had history of encephalopathy recurrent attacks in the last 1 year. He also had one episode of, he had undergone LVP once in April. He had one, this is important, he had one episode of AKI-HRS, which he improved with terlipressin 2 months back. There is no other comorbidities, there's no significant family history, there's no history of CAM or NSAID use. On examination, he was tuberous, poorly responsive. His hemodynamics BP was just 100/60, and there were some basic reputations. He was admitted to the liver ICU. Initial labs showed deranged liver function test with bilirubin of 20 and creatinine of 2.8 and coagulopathy. Cultures were sent as per the protocol, and he was started on empirical antibiotics, anti-coma measures, terlipressin for the kidney injury, and so on. So this was his initial labs. You can see a bilirubin of 20 and INR of 1.9, and his creatinine was 2.7 at admission. Hemoglobin was 8, and so on. CT test was done for the COVID protocol. It showed CORADS 2, but unfortunately the COVID-19 PCR swab was negative. For the sepsis screening, we had also done acidic fluid analysis, which showed a total count of 4,890 cells with a neutrophils of 82%. Suggestive of SVP because it was transurethral fluid, and even gene expert was negative. So the diagnosis we made after this initial evaluation was acute and chronic liver failure ascites and jaundice, coagulopathy and encephalopathy. He had encephalopathy grade 3 at admission. Organ failures, he had liver, kidney, and brain. I'll be showing the different gradings. He had sepsis in the form of spontaneous bacterial peritonitis, and he had previous history of SBP, HA, and HRS. So what is the definition of ACLF? So we can say this patient is a progressive decompensation liver cirrhosis. But why am I calling it ACLF? So this was first defined by APSL as an acute hepatic insult manifesting as jaundice with defined as bilirubin more than 5 and coagulopathy with INR more than 1.5, complicated within 4 weeks by ascites and or encephalopathy in a patient with previously diagnosed or undiagnosed chronic liver disease. Basically, the concept was ACLF was a patient with underlying chronic liver disease, which can be even fibrosis or cirrhosis. When they are exposed to an acute insult, usually APSL says hepatic insult, that I'll be showing the differences between APSL and EASL. So they develop rapid liver injury and there'll be a cytokine storm followed by multi-organ failure and culmination to and they expire because of sepsis. So then, but because the caveats in APSL definition was the jaundice and INR, they were all arbitrary. It was not a prospectively studied data initially, but they had fixed a definition based on the concept of ACLF, and then they tried to extrapolate that definition and see whether was it working in identified patients of ACLF. So EASL, they looked this in a different way. They said any patient of liver disease, of cirrhosis or non-cirrhosis, or especially cirrhosis, when they have a high short-term mortality defined as more than 15%. Short-term is 1 month mortality defined as more than 15%. They said they are having ACLF. And they prospectively studied these patients and they saw that those patients with organ failures, they was told this of ACLF. So they defined ACLF in this prospective series case cohort study as a condition occurring within a 4 weeks period of jaundice and an inciting event in the form in patients with chronic liver disease with or without cirrhosis, which results in decompensation. And most important is failure of 2 or more extrahepatic organs, resulting in an increased mortality within a period of 3 months from the onset, and high short-term mortality depending on the number of organ failures as defined by Cliff-SOFA score. This can develop in previously decompensated, compensated, or early decompensated, and it can be because of even sepsis or any other mechanisms. So ACLF EASL definition doesn't bother about sepsis, but APSL defines that sepsis is a consequence of liver failure. And the APSL cohort, the mortality was around 25% in the APSL study cohort. The EASL, the mortality was 34%. Mortality is 1 month mortality, 28 days mortality. So it was almost similar. But even in the APSL cohort, when they defined organ failure by SOFA score, when a patient of ACLF defined by APSL criteria had organ failures as defined by SOFA score, they had around 50% mortality compared to those without organ failures are only 5% mortality. Whereas in EASL Cliff cohort, this canonic study, they had higher mortality depending on the grading of ACLF. So these are the essential differences between the two, which has always been a topic of discussion in our community, as Ashwin has rightly said initially. But the concept is what I want to convey to the audience. No matter how we look at it, the concept is the same. An acute insult to a liver which has a reduced reserve results in a propagation of ACLF, that is manifesting as organ failures and high short-term mortality. That is the definition. That is the basic crux of the concept of ACLF. So usually both definitions, they say it in 4 weeks. Acute insult, the APSL says liver failure is the one which drives everything. Whereas this EASL consortium, they say liver failure as well as extrahepatic organ failures both drive this process, and it did not be only liver failure alone. Secondly, sepsis, in the APSL, they say sepsis is a consequence of liver failure. Because of liver failure, they have stunned immunity and they develop sepsis. Whereas in EASL, they say whatever be the insult, if the end result is high mortality, it is ACLF. So no matter what, if we go into the subsequent lecture, you will see that this doesn't make any difference in the treatment outcome. But the similarities are, both of them say high mortality, both of them say it's a distinct entity from ALF, and both of them say, most importantly, early consideration for a timely liver transplant. And organ failure and sepsis are the most important cause of high mortality in this distinct group of patients. So there was a consensus definition between the two groups, EASL and APSL, and that was called World Gastroenterology Organization definition. It was published in 2014, where they said it can be type A, type B, type C ACLF. Type A means non-cirrhotic, type B means compensated cirrhotic developing ACLF, type C is decompensated cirrhotic developing ACLF. So what now I've been telling about organ failures. Now what is this organ failures? So even the APSL has given definition for organ failures recent lecture on CLIF-SOFA score, because most of the data on transplantation has been derived from this canonic study from the CLIF-SOFA score from the EASL cohort. That's why I'll be explaining mainly about CLIF-SOFA score today. So they define liver failure as mainly in the bold, liver failure as if a patient had bilirubin more than 12, like our patient, he had bilirubin more than 20. So he had liver failure. Our patient had kidney failure, creatinine was 2.7. Our patient had grade 3 encephalopathy, so he had cerebral failure. Our patient had INR 1.9, so he did not have coagulation failure. This is at baseline. Our patient had minimal inotropic support, so he had circulatory failure, and he did not have respiratory failure. So this is a different definition how to define organ failures. The non-bold ones are organ dysfunction. Please understand the difference between organ dysfunction and organ failure. Organ failure is the one which defines the mortality, which defines the outcome, which defines the decision about liver transplantation. So based on this, ACLF grading was made based on the number of organ failures. So ACLF 0 means no organ failure or single non-kidney organ failure with a creatinine of less than 1.5. So if a patient has creatinine less than 1.5 and he has grade 3 encephalopathy, it is ACLF 0. And the 28-day mortality for them was 4.7%. When ACLF 1 means a single kidney failure, that is creatinine more than 2, or cerebral failure with creatinine 1.5 to 1.9, or single non-cerebral failure, but basically ACLF 1 means either kidney failure or non-kidney failure with creatinine more than 1.5, less than 1.5 to 1.9. So because the single predictor of outcome was renal dysfunction in this cohort. ACLF 2, if there are 2 organ failures. ACLF 3, if they have more than 3 or more than 3 organ failures. And as we see, as the number of organ failures are increasing, the 28-day mortality was 4.7% ACLF 0 to 72% ACLF 1. 32% and 76% is ACLF 3. So the sickest group was ACLF 3. So our patient at admission, like I said, he had bilirubin 20. So he had liver failure, he had creatinine 2.7, he had kidney failure, he had HE grade 3, he had cerebral failure. So he had 3 organ failures, and he also had minimal inotropic support, but inotropic support present means circulatory failure. So he had 4 organ failures, means he had ACLF grade 3, means he has 28-day mortality of 76% at baseline. So, like I said, sepsis in ACL, this is a very contentious topic because both APSL and EASL keep fighting about it. APSL says, like I said, sepsis is a consequence. EASL says whatever be it, sepsis also can be a precipitant. But why is ACLF patients prone for sepsis? In ACLF, they have monocyte energy, they have decreased dendritic cell function, they have decreased CD4, CD8 cells, and that leads to propagate sepsis, bacterial translocation, gut bacterial translocation, and there's rising bilirubin severity scores, and that culminates in opportunistic infections, endotoxemia, sepsis, septic shock, and associated with multi-organ dysfunction. So this is an important concept about hepatic reserve and therapeutic golden window. This is advocated by Dr. Sarin's group. So in this graph, this schematic diagram we see, I hope I'm audible to everybody. So in this schematic diagram, we see a patient with ACLF. A patient with ACLF has reduced hepatic reserve, and a patient with decompensated liver disease has even worse hepatic reserve. But when both of them have been exposed to an insult, the ACLF patient rapidly deteriorates, But because he has a better hepatic reserve than a decompensated liver disease patient, they have some chance of which even in the canonic study, they said distinct entity, 40% of the patients can recover spontaneously, provided the etiology is identified, provided they given the timely treatment. And 30% patients have a downhill course and 20% patients have a fluctuating course in canonic study. So this schematic diagram clearly emphasizes the need to identify patients in this therapeutic golden window, which is usually in the first week of presentation. I'll also be emphasizing why this first week is so important. Because this first week of presentation, if we identify patients before they develop more organ failures, they can even be considered for liver transplantation, and that has an excellent survival, even if it is ACLF3, which I'll be showing subsequently. So what about decision making? So like our patient coming back, in view of persistent AKI-HRS, even after aggressive medical therapy, he was started on hemodialysis. Because after starting terlipressin also for 40 hours, he did not make urine. He continued to remain acidotic. So he was started on hemodialysis. But because of hemodynamic instability, he was started on CRRT. Fortunately, wife came forward for donation. Donor workup was suitable. So CRRT was started and family was explained that after sepsis is controlled, because patient had active SBP and he had circulatory dysfunction and he was started on CRRT and he was grade 3 encephalopathy. We said after he stabilized, we will see within a week. So what happened in this week? Repeat acidic tap at day 5 showed a corrected total count of 480 cells, means SPP was there, but it was improving. And repeat urine culture grew Klebsiella. Fortunately, it was not MDR Klebsiella, but he was continued on carbapenems. And HE, fortunately, HE, which he came with grade 3, HE had improved to grade 1 because of CRRT. And he was also tolerating NG feeds. So clinically, he was looking better, but lab-wise, he was the same, and he continued on CRRT. So this was the parameters. On day 5, we see bilirubin was 24, INR was increasing to 3.2, and the creatinine on day 3, he was started on CRRT, and we see after starting CRRT, the creatinine improved, that is because of the dialysis, but he also had always a persistent total leukocyte count. And one point I want to emphasize about CLIF SOFA score, there's something called CLIF C ACLF score, which is in which they have added 2 more parameters, that is age and total leukocyte count, because these 2 parameters also have shown to be independently prognostic predictors of outcome in ACLF. So CLIF SOFA score plus age plus when they include age and this other parameter, it is called total leukocyte count. It's called CLIF C ACLF score, by which the prediction of mortality of the outcome was increased by 30%. So in our patient, initially he was grade 3, which I had shown. After starting albumin and antibiotics for SBP, CRRT was started for AKI-HRS, and anticoagulation measures were continued. Nutrition was given. At day 5, he was in ACLF grade 2. So when is the right time to do transplant in this critically ill cirrhotics? So this is a UNOS database study in which they had seen, because the UNOS in the West, it's mainly cadaver program, and listing is done as per MELD score. Study was done basically to define whether MELD score can extrapolate the outcome of ACLF. And this study has clearly shown MELD has no relevance in ACLF, because MELD doesn't include organ failures, which is seen here, that patients who were listed in status 1A, and those patients in that listed patients had ACLF, the waitlist mortality at 7 days was 18%, but at 21 days was 32% in ACLF3, whereas those with status 1A, that is not only cirrhotic, not ACLF, had 19. So non-ACLF patients had 19% at 21 days, and ACLF3 had 32% at 21 days. This means just by listing patients for cadaver transplant on MELD score doesn't hold true for ACLF patients, because it doesn't include organ failures. So this is an extremely important study. I recommend the postgraduates who are listening to this presentation to please read this paper, because this is this paper, the landmark paper from canonic study, which has shown the different concepts of. So first message was patient should be considered and ACLF grading should be done from day 3 to day 7 because they had seen that baseline. Because they'd seen at baseline the baseline ACLF grading at baseline did not define outcome, but ACLF defining the grading of ACLF from day 3 to day 7 had defined the outcome much better. Second message was, if you see here in this first Kaplan-Meier, in ACLF 0, in no ACLF, they had good survival. And as the number of organ failures increased, we see the survival had gone to a dismal 12% in ACLF 3 and 42% in ACLF 2. And those patients who were transplanted, we see in this Kaplan-Meier, non-transplanted patients with ACLF 2 or 3 at day 3, day 7, the survival was only 23% non-transplant, whereas when they were early transplant within 1 week, in this study, the median time to transplant was 11 days. Was 95% at 28 days, and 6 months it was 80%. That is phenomenal for ACLF 2 or 3. And in this cohort, 38% patients were ACLF 3, that is 3 or more organ failures. So these patients, so the message of this paper was, if you identify ACLF, please triage them, and day 3 to day 7, grade the ACLF, manage organ failures. And one more important message in this paper was, none of these patients had respiratory failure. Please note, none of these patients had respiratory failure as defined by PO2 by FOT less than 200, and only 30% patients had circulatory failure. Means they had inotropic support. The to NORAD was less than 0.6 mics per kg per minute. So this is a concept of earliest the best. Now in our setting, it is mainly living donor because unfortunately, as per the Government of India norms, we cannot list a patient of ACLF for urgent liver transplantation. So the probability of a patient getting a cadaver in 1 week is next to impossible in our setting. So this is where LDLT plays an important role. This is from other parts of the world. This data is mainly from shown very good survival in ACLF. The survival was 80 to 90% in most of the case series. But this is a nice Austrian study. This study they had done in transplant in 33 patients of ACLF, and they take APSL of ACLF. And in that, they said that by transplanting patients of ACLF defined by APSL also, there was 1 year and 5 year survival at 87% and 82%, and comparatively in 93% and 82% in CLD cohort. Means the ACLF patients also had relatively good survival at 1 year and 5 years compared to non-ACLF patients. And the median transplant-free survival was 48 days, and the waitlist mortality, please note, this is very important data, waitlist mortality was 54% in this cohort. Even in the canonic study cohort, the waitlist mortality was 45%. And only 10 out of the 144 patients survived without transplant in this entire cohort. So we see that those patients who were transplanted, who were not transplanted, had a high chance of mortality compared to those patients who did not have ACLF. And they also, this paper also said that on multivariate analysis, those patients on ventilator support or active sepsis had very poor outcome compared to other organ failures. So sepsis and ventilatory support preclude transplantation and associated poor outcome. This is another paper for transplantation in multi-organ failures outcome. So this was a retrospective UNOS database of patients who underwent transplant within 30 days of listing. So only those patients who were transplanted within 30 days were selected. And in them, the median time to transplant after listing was 4 to 5 days in those patients with ACL, in patients with more than 3 organ failures. And they also said in those patients who were transplanted early, within 4 to 5 days, the chance of survival, even in those patients with more than 3 organ failures, that is ACLF 3, had 84%, 81%, and 81% survival, even with 3, 4, and 5 to 6 organ failures. But extremely poor prognosis if they were only on the waiting list, and just 2.8% survived at 1 month. Means those patients who were transplanted within 1 week after in stabilization from an ICU setting and organ failures rightly tackled have a good prognosis. So number of organ failures was an independent predictor of survival post-transplant. This is also a very nice study recently published in Gastro. They had seen what are the factors which predict survival in patients with ACLF and after transplantation. So we see here three, the subset of patients, more amount of patients were having alcoholic liver disease, whereas non-ACLF or ACLF1 were viral related. So alcoholic related liver disease patients had more rapid course and presentation as ACLF2 or 3 advanced ACLF. And this is an important graph where they are seeing that even with a low MELD sodium had a high mortality of more than 43.8%. Means if you categorize these patients as per MELD, and we divide them, categorize as less than 25, 25 to 29, 30 or more than 35, MELD did not correlate with outcome, but organ failures and ACLF3 had more worse outcome. The third message of this paper was what were the predictors of 1 year mortality post-transplant among patients who were transplanted with ACLF3. In them, those patients who had mechanical ventilation, circulatory failure, or 4 or more organ failures had a negative outcome, and futility score more than 8, donor risk index more than 1.7, transplantation within 30 days had better, whereas futility score more than 8, function and donor risk index more than 1.7, they had poor outcome, and functional status is good, means they had better outcome. And what about organ failures? In this, they had seen, if you see in the multivariate analysis, a hazard ratio was maximum with ventilator support and renal failure. So if patients had ventilator support or patients had renal failure requiring CRRT more than 1 week, they had poor outcome, both short-term and long-term post-transplant. This is something futility study where when they are too sick, they are what we discussed, what Ashwin, what Vasant also has said, those with cerebral edema, brain edema, circulatory failure, pulmonary respiratory failure, active infections, acute necrotizing pancreatitis. This is a concept. This basically holds true for even non-ACLF patients also. But take-home message is Canonic study and the other studies which have done, they have said those patients with respiratory failure should be avoided with PaO2 FiO2 less than 200, with high circulatory support, inotropic support of NORAD more than 0.6 mics, CRRT requiring more than a week, these patients should not be transplanted. Coming back to a patient, the LDLT was prepared, donor was ready, but what happened? At day 7, patient had progressive hypoxia, CT chest showed ARDS, hemodynamic instability was worsening, requiring dual vasopressors. Hence, LDLT was withheld and patient died few days later. So fortunately, we had withheld transplantation in this patient, even though everything was ready. And because we knew that this patient is not going to make it because he had a bad chest. That's the main reason we did not transplant this patient. And he had expired few days later. This is one study about reduction of MELD score or reduction of or optimization of these patients of ACLF with artificial liver support systems. I'll not be going to the details, but importantly, what they said was the amount of blood loss and intubation time post-transplant was better by doing this plasmapheresis and these methods. But ICU stay was almost similar in both the groups. So finally, treatment algorithm. This I again picked up from the Canonic study. We first classified the patients of ACLF grading based on day 3 to day 7 after presentation, and then if assessed for transplantation. If there is no contraindication, we proceed, and if there is contraindication or they have more organ failure or respiratory failure, we withdraw care. So take-home message: ACLF is an extremely dynamic syndrome, evolving towards resolution or improvement in 49% patients, a fluctuating course in 30%, and downhill course in 20%. It is important to identify, and triage them in the therapeutic golden window. That's usually in 1 week of presentation. Define the organ failures at baseline, and more importantly, from day 3 to day 7 to grade the syndrome and prognosticate. The patient should be managed in a trained liver ICU, timely liver transplant, preferably in 1 week of listing, before the onset of MODS, especially ventilatory support, and needing prolonged supports more than a week. So basically, these patients should be managed like an ALF, but they have a chance of recovery if you do in the right time. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Excellent, Dr. Chandan. I felt like a student in your class. It was very comprehensive, and you covered all the points as well. We have Prof in the audience. If are you there, Prof?
Yeah, I'm here.
I have a few questions, and I can start with the questions, and then maybe the audience can join in, and then I can maybe ask both Vasant and Chandan the question first, and then you can give your expert comment on it. The first question was something which Vasant was talking initially about assist devices. Now, it was a fad maybe about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. But now we know that about 5 years ago, the ELAD was withdrawn. So why do you think it has happened, Vasant? And where do you see the future of assist devices? Why don't we have a simple CRRT for the liver to tide over the crisis and then maybe allow the liver to regenerate? Both Vasant and Chandra, we can take turns to answer that.
Vasant is muted.
Yeah.
Chandan, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Hi, Chandan.
So basically in ALF, the study which Vasant had quoted was, they had said that by doing plasmapheresis in ALF, that reduce the nitric oxide levels, they reduce the cytokine levels IL-6, with which the circulatory dysfunction had improved, and there was some improvement was there. But basically the important message in this paper was, it was not that these patients had transplant-free survival. These patients had better survival with transplantation. They were more optimized for transplantation by doing plasmapheresis in ALF. But as Professor Menden always says, this paper is not to be taken as a Bible for doing plasmapheresis in ALF, but this is only a concept which says that by doing plasmapheresis, the cytokine levels come down, and by which we can optimize the patients better for taking of liver transplantation. And
yeah,
I do not about bioartificial livers in ALF.
Yeah, exactly what I was asking. And we used to have the Mars and the MELS and the ELAD.
The Prometheus and the Mars, they also have been done in ALF and even in ACLF also, but none of the studies have shown a survival benefit with kidney dysfunction had some benefit. The ALF, there was not much data. Even in ACLF also, similar results were seen.
Prof, what is your take on these devices? Do you think they have a future, or are they passé, and then they've been tried?
No, see, I've been looking at these devices. I was involved in Prometheus in the very, very early days, actually, and the Kings, they've done many studies. Even the bioartificial livers where they used the hepatoblastoma cell lines and all of that. The idea was to provide a liver function, okay? And I'm not talking about plasmapheresis and things where you're removing the cytokines, which is a more recent concept because the bioartificial livers failed. And then wait for regeneration to happen. Now, if you, in acute liver failure, if you lost even about 75% of the hepatocytes, so you could do a 75% hepatectomy actually, and patients will survive without liver failure. So technically for them to actually fulfill criteria for transplant, you have to lose a huge volume of hepatocytes. In fact, when you do liver biopsies on patients who fulfill criteria for transplantation acute liver failure, they hardly have 1 to 2% of hepatocytes left behind. Now, if from the auxiliary liver transplant data, we know that it takes a long time for patients to really regenerate and recover to an extent that they don't require the bioartificial liver support. And the problem here in all of this is the time to regenerate is so large, sometimes 3 months to 6 months really to have a decent, particularly when they're completely wiped out of their hepatocytes, as in paracetamol overdose. Most of them have been tried in the hyperacute liver failures anyway. You can't maintain them long enough. In fact, the cost would have been very huge. Unlike the, I think at that time, I remember each cartridge for the bioartificial liver would cost something like 15,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds. And they last for 2 days. And if you have to be supporting them for 3 months or 6 months, it's practically impossible, number one. And also, I don't know, the regeneration may also be delayed if you're providing with hepatocyte function from outside, like we see in auxiliary liver transplant. So they were really not viable. They always said, oh, there is some improvement, there is some reduction in ammonia, there is some hemodynamic stability by doing it, which is why all of these techniques, in fact, help to stabilize patient as a bridge to transplant. So they could show that you could stabilize patients with these, even with a plasmapheresis, you could stabilize the patient by removing the cytokines, make them stable enough for transplant, offer them transplant, and the survival of transplant improves. And not actually for somebody to survive without transplantation. It's never going to be possible. So that's how the whole system has failed. Many, many companies have put so much money into research by artificial liver, and none of these machines have really worked so far. And I think most people have now abandoned these as an idea.
Yeah, the last was the ELAD, which they shut down recently. The whole program was shut down. My other question is in both acute liver failure and ACLF after the transplant, is there any difference in the immunosuppression protocol or immunosuppressive protocol which you would follow, Dr. Vasant, Dr. Chandan, or is it just the same? Dr. Vasant, would you like to go first?
It is the same immunosuppression for ALF and ACLF. We use
as compared to other transplants. I'm saying as compared to chronic liver disease.
As compared to chronic liver disease in ALF, these patients are younger patients. They have high risk of rejection. So in cases there is in patients if the patients are very sick with renal replacement therapy and neurological disturbances, maybe the tacrolimus can be switched to cyclosporine. So we can modulate the immunosuppression with that. So otherwise, the standard triple regimen is followed in ALF.
Chandan, what do you feel about?
In ACLF, basically they are more septic, more sicker patients. So what usually we should do is we should have a lower threshold, and we should use basically lesser amount of steroid, keep a low TAC, have and delay the initiation of MMF metabolites, and avoid this basiliximab and other these drugs. Because even if the patient has kidney injury, like we may say patient of ACLF has renal dysfunction or renal failure on CRRT, it's advisable better to avoid basiliximab and these immunomodulators because they have a high chance of sepsis post-op. Because they are usually the sick group of patients, and when they are sick and they have a lesser requirement for immunosuppression. But as Vasant said, in ALF, the scenario is different. They're healthy people and they had sudden liver failure and a more younger population. So that is fine. But ACLF, we have to be a little more cautious and basically manage the electrolytes and the nutrition part and the anatropes and the supports, and keep a less and try to not be over immunosuppressant.
Yeah, can I make a comment?
Sure, please.
I think Chandan is right. I think Chandan, you gave a very good talk actually. Both of them gave a good talk, and I liked Chandan because Chandan's special interest is ACLF. I think you chose the right term.
Thank you, sir.
That talk. I think it's a delay. It's about being the two things that you need to be aware of is sepsis in these patients, and a lot of them may have really underlying sepsis. And the second, I think and also renal impairment. I think you can delay initiation of tacrolimus. As Vasant said, I wouldn't substitute cyclosporin to tacrolimus and say cyclosporin is better than tacrolimus. I don't think there's a huge evidence to suggest. Both are calcineurin inhibitors. So I wouldn't make that as a blanket statement. I think quite often we switch cyclosporin in our program more for neurotoxicity rather than for renal impairment. I can tell you something from my observation of doing things and how slowly people switch to old ways or to stronger immunosuppression. You know, when tacrolimus came into use, we saw that as a drug that can ultimately be a monotherapy. Actually, when we were using cyclosporin, I'm talking about say 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we used cyclosporin with azathioprine and steroids. So it was a triple immunosuppression, and over a period of time, many people came up and said steroids can be stopped. And then it was a double drug in the long term. But many of them were on a very small dose of steroids anyway. If you look at the older surgeons would have, or hepatologists, would have a very small dose of steroids in these patients. And then tacrolimus came, and tacrolimus obviously is a much more powerful drug than cyclosporin. I mean, if you look at in the early days of transplantation, the graft loss due to chronic rejection was 15%. You wouldn't believe that. None of you guys see chronic rejection as a cause of graft loss now. So very clearly there was at least a 10% survival advantage with tacrolimus. So obviously it's a more powerful immunosuppression. But liver transplantation, in the early days, maybe we were looking at more powerful immunosuppression. Today, we are not really looking at more powerful immunosuppression. It's the word that people use is a tailored immunosuppression. In fact, you want less immunosuppression without rejection and a long-term survival, and rest sepsis is what you want. So we thought that tacrolimus has come, which is more powerful than cyclosporin, and therefore we're not going to need azathioprine. So in the early days, we were using tacrolimus with steroids, and then 3 months later, we stopped the steroids, and then they were on a monotherapy. Now, slowly what's happened, MMF came into the picture, and mainly MMF came into the picture as a renal preserving in combination with tacrolimus, so we can run tacrolimus at a lower level. So the advantage of MMF is that you can run patients with a tacrolimus level of less than 5 with an MMF. But it still ultimately amounts to more immunosuppression. So unless the renal is not an issue, I think we should only use tacrolimus at a low dose as a monotherapy. But slowly we are slipping back into this system that even in our own program, because I'm not actually watching every patient and what immunosuppression they're on, we find that now most of the patients are on tacrolimus and MMF, which is actually more immunosuppression than we used to in the earlier days with cyclosporin and azathioprine. Azathioprine is inferior to MMF and cyclosporin is inferior to tacrolimus. Now we have landed up with 2 drugs which are more powerful. And I don't know where we are going. I just want people to think and be conscious that we should still stick to the principle that tacrolimus is more powerful than cyclosporin, and therefore it doesn't need azathioprine. And therefore we should really be, if renal is not an issue, sticking to a single drug regime. And if renal is an issue, then you have a small dose of MMF with the whole idea that the tacrolimus level should be extremely low. If you don't have a lowest tacrolimus level, then there is no point using MMF. That's what I want. I want just people to think about it when they are reviewing patients post-transplant in the long run, that they don't keep them on 2 drugs now, when actually tacrolimus alone is adequate.
Sure. Am I audible? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I saw an interesting slide which Vasant put up was about recellularizing the liver. So I would like both Vasant, Chandan, and Prof to give their opinion. Can we actually do away with the transplantation for acute liver failure with recellularizing the liver? I mean, it's something which we are doing now with IIT as well. Abdul, I don't know if Abdul is there in the audience. If he's there, it was
I'm there,
his topic. Yeah. Hi, Abdul. Yeah. So yeah, it was your PhD topic. I mean, it's something very interesting. I would like more light to be shed on this with regards to recellularizing an acute liver failure liver, especially since the scaffold is intact.
I think, do you want Vasant to go first?
Vasant can go first, and then maybe Abdul can come next, and then Prof can give his opinion. Okay, Vasant, go for it.
The process of decellularization of organs, it involves the removal of immunogenic molecules and the tissue from the tissues for an extracellular matrix. The major limitation in this method is the thrombogenesis and the reconstruction of vascular integrity of the liver. So that is the major limiting factor in repopulation of this decellularized organs. So that is a limiting factor for this method.
Shall I make a comment, Ashwin?
Yeah.
I think Vasant. Yeah, I think Vasant gave you sort of a gist of what the problem is. So what I did we did as a research in Leeds was that I used to take human liver. I think the discarded human liver, which was not transplantable. We used to split them into left lateral lobes and right posterior lobes, and using the left lateral lobe, we perfuse the decellularization solution and remove all the cells from it. At the end, what you see is a liver which is transparent, which has got all the vessel patency and the bile duct, everything is patent, but what it has got is only collagen. So that's why it is thrombogenic, like what Vasant said. So far, what we have reached with this study, or any.
If I may just stop you there. So assuming it is now an acute liver failure liver, which you see, I mean, it's quite similar, isn't it? You have lost all the hepatocytes and you just have the scaffolding and all the ultrastructure behind.
I think, recellularizing again with the fresh hepatocytes, the only problem is that the acute insult would still be there, Ashwin. I think if that's what you're asking, recellularizing within the patient, and the hepatocytes don't really. One of the problem with the hepatocyte is that culturing it to a volume that they can remain viable, and then to transplanting it itself is a big process, and they don't remain viable longer. Even in the decellularized liver, when you put on endothelial cells into the vessels, and then you sort of transfuse hepatocytes within these matrices, the hepatocytes don't really last long at all. I think the maximum it has been shown to last long is about 21 days, and after that you see that they are slowly dying within these hepatocytes as well. So we don't really understand how we can actually keep them going for longer, and also prevent them from de-differentiating into different other cells. That's what happens with that. I think, Prof made a very valid point that one of the problem is the cost of using any of these extracorporeal devices, because one of the ways we were thinking is that we can use these scaffolds, keep the hepatocytes growing in it, and then use it as a scaffold to use it as an extracorporeal device. But you need, I think, meta-analysis has shown that you need at least 8. You need to treat 8 patients to get one benefit in an ALF situation. In ACLF, I think none of these extracorporeal devices have shown any benefit at all.
Prof,
you're all asking very nice and very exciting fields. I mean, these ideas were thought to be really at the forefront, actually. I worked with Anil, and we were working on hepatocytes. And the question you're asking, for simplicity for people who are listening to this, is you're saying is acute liver failure is a situation where we have selectively wiped out hepatocytes. Now, why don't we put hepatocytes from a donor liver? Instead of transplanting the liver, why don't we put hepatocytes into the liver?
Absolutely.
And they really home into the new liver, and now we have got a hepatocyte transplant rather than doing an orthotopic whole liver transplant. We tried that, actually. The hepatocyte transplant works wherever the volume of hepatocytes needed is extremely small. So we have seen that. We have done that for OTC, the urea cycle defects, ornithine transcarbamylase deficiency. We have done that for even Crigler-Najjar syndrome. Crigler-Najjar hardly requires 4% of hepatocytes, so you can infuse maybe 10%, even if 10% is lost. It will drop the bilirubin because the hepatocytes will become viable for some times. But the problem with hepatocyte transplant is you can't monitor that they will stay, and they are foreign, and therefore they may get slowly rejected and disappear over a period of time. So the longevity of hepatocytes is a problem in metabolic liver disease. But in acute liver failure, we told you earlier on, so in acute liver failure, if you remove the liver and transplant them with the left lateral segment, they won't survive, will they? They won't survive because the GRWR is so low. Say a GRWR of a left lateral segment will be 0.5. And they won't survive. The hepatocyte transplant will never give you an equivalent GRWR of 1%. That means you've got to put in, I don't know, maybe about 500 grams of viable hepatocytes, which is practically impossible to do, because if you put 500 grams of viable hepatocytes through the portal vein, it will clog everything. It will not go into the sinusoids and go and sit there. So practically, it's absolutely impossible to infuse hepatocytes into the skeleton that is left behind after acute liver failure to make a patient survive. That's why hepatocyte transplant or repopulation of the liver doesn't work. Repopulation can only work if there is already liver function and you've got a partial liver with that. There was one idea that I've always been thinking. Say in a patient with say biliary atresia or any other condition, you take the liver out, not metabolic obviously. You take the liver out, you transplant them. Actually, you transplant them with a new liver, but retrieve their hepatocytes if they are good and viable, because in most of the cirrhotics, the hepatocytes may be normal. It's the architecture which is disturbed, and functionally, the liver is not. And then you repopulate using their hepatocytes into the grafted liver. But that takes time for it to repopulate, because it can repopulate by multiplying once you put it in. If you imagine, it's got the advantage because the repopulating cells are the native cells that you retrieve from the explant liver. I've always tried to do that. And then is there a potential for repopulating livers like that and withdrawing immunosuppression? Yeah, the idea is if we can withdraw immunosuppression because the liver is repopulated by its own cells, then that's possible. But unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, because the transplanted liver, the most immunogenic cells are probably the biliary epithelial cells, vascular endothelial cells. And therefore, and in fact, the rejection process is actually a biliary epithelial damage. Both acute rejection as well as the chronic rejection is disappearance of bile duct. So actually, by repopulating a patient with the patient's own hepatocytes still won't solve the problem of stopping immunosuppression, and therefore it's not practical. So we are still really thinking about the whole affair. I don't know when we are going to find out. And I mean, all of these repopulations can only work as auxiliary livers in peritoneal cavities and things like that for temporary support in order for the native liver to recover. That's probably the only possibility for the future. But then we are left with the problem of how much liver is required to make a patient survive. That's going to be the huge issue. How much hepatocytes is required. And that's practically very difficult.
It was an excellent point, Prof. Absolutely mind-blowing, to think of a concept of repopulating the native hepatocyte into a transplanted liver. Which was actually my next question. If we had a hepatocyte organoid, maybe in the omentum or something to sort of temporize, but then you answered that as well, as saying that if you needed 500 grams, it would be maybe a few million hepatocytes, which would actually be required to sort of keep the liver function going. My next question is actually with regards to something ethical. Now, if we have an ALF patient which comes to us in India, do we work up a donor as soon as they fulfill the King's College criteria? Do we need to do that? Both ALF or ACLF. I mean, say they come in with an acute decompensation. Do we start looking at the donor and saying that, okay, we need to keep a donor standby, or is there like a particular threshold where we say that, we will, after this, we'll start working up the donor? Dr. Vasant?
When a patient is first diagnosed with ALF, we need to see the prognostic factors, increasing grades of HE. When the patient is fitting the criteria for transplant, we have to immediately work up the donor, because in subacute cases of subacute liver failure, patients have increased morbidity and mortality, and when they reach the HE point, the deterioration is very rapid, and we might lose the patient, and there is an increased waitlist mortality. So it's better to start the donor workup as soon as the patient fits the criteria.
Chandan, what would you do? I mean, as soon as the INR crosses 6.5, would you start working up a donor? What would you do?
In ALF, I think we should start working up the donor immediately when a patient comes with ALF and King cases criteria are fulfilled. Regarding ACLF, if the patient having organ failures, we define at baseline and at day 3 to day 7. At baseline, if they have ACLF 0 or 1, means no organ failure or less than 2 organ failures, or kidney functions is normal, we can manage medically for the next 48 hours and see by day 3. If they have at presentation, they have come in ARDS with respiratory failure requiring ventilatory support, or they have inotropic support, then it's a futile exercise to even consider transplantation in them. So just manage them medically and just support the care. That is the algorithm I had shown. In ALF, because they are stable people, they were actually normal people who had a sudden insult and they had ALF. In them, we had to be more aggressive and we had to list them for transplant if they fulfill the cases criteria, and also start intensive care management in the liver ICU, plasmapheresis, CRRT, all the supports. And suppose in the next 48 hours they turn around, we can delist them. But if they do not turn around and they continue, they persist in the same, but they have been medically optimized, we should proceed for transplantation. Because in both the conditions, the most important message to all the audience is timely transplantation, and the median time should be less than 1 week.
I agree. I actually had an addendum to that question, which is why I asked it. I mean, in most cases, both what you said would be right. I would like Prof's opinion on this. But when we look at
I wonder what your addendum is.
Prof?
I wonder what you're coming to from this. Because I'm thinking of something which maybe you're also thinking of. See, practically, I think ACLF has got time anyway. ACLF, once you decide to transplant, you can work up, and most of the living donor workup can be done within 24, 48 hours anyway. If you ask me like that, even in acute liver failure, you've really got time. It's not that you don't have time. Very often, for convenience, we do that because we can do it in a relaxed manner, and also it takes time to really condition patients to come for a workup. Very often in an Indian family, immediately when they come, they may be receptive, and then 1 or 2 days you're telling the patients stable, may recover, and then they back out, and then they think, let's give a chance without transplantation, and it goes on like that. And I think it is practical too, but I want to say something, because there is a huge amount of confusion in the very young people between the definition of acute liver failure and fulfilling criteria for transplant. They're different. A huge number of people may actually fulfill the definition of acute liver failure, that is encephalopathy and onset of illness within 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or 12 weeks. But the number of patients who fulfill definition of acute liver failure, or sometimes even acute hepatitis is confused with acute liver failure without encephalopathy, and a proportion of them who require liver transplant is actually not very high. I don't know, Chandan might know the answer. Acute liver failure patients requiring transplantation is what, probably 20%? I don't think it's more than that. So the majority of the acute liver failure will recover without the need. It's only when they fulfill criteria. Pardon?
If they're hyperactive, they recover much faster, sir.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, these days paracetamols also recover very well. So only 20% of acute liver failure potentially will need transplantation or fulfill criteria. And that's why you need to be very careful that you start working up a donor and you have a temptation to actually carry on and transplant them. And you should never be transplanting somebody who has a potential to recover spontaneously. So if you say, I am ready to work up a patient who actually at this moment doesn't require a transplant, and I'm working up thinking that the patient might require a transplant, that leads to a problem. You might even say, I can list a patient and keep in the cadaver list because organ availability for emergency situation is so difficult. And then if the patient recovers, I'll remove the patient. That won't be allowed, will it? In the disease donor waiting list, you wouldn't be allowed to list a patient unless they fulfill criteria for transplant. And why should it be different that you're able to start work up a donor when they have not fulfilled criteria for transplant? So that's one of the ethics that we need to really think of and answer. As long as we are very clear in our mind that we will not transplant those patients unless they actually fulfill the criteria for transplant, it's okay to be ready with it, maybe in our setting, but we need to be careful about it.
And sure, Prof. And you would have certain pathologies like rat oil poisoning where the actual drug itself, the rat oil poison would raise the INR to 6.5. So that need not be because of the liver failure itself. So how are we gonna choose patients in rat oil poisoning for a transplant? I mean, they have fulfilled criteria, and because the INR has gone above 6.5 because of its anticoagulant effect, but it's not because of the liver failure itself.
I think I don't
want to answer that, Chandan, and then maybe
Ratol, I don't think we have worked out the indication for transplant for Ratol that well, actually.
Hello.
I don't know if Chandan wants to answer that, but Ratol poisoning, I don't know if Srinivas Reddy is in the audience. He's the one who did the consensus meeting on Ratol poisoning. He might want to say something about it. But the point that you are making about INR is very important. I have, when I went to King's, I think 4 or 5 years ago, when I was still returning back, John O'Grady presented a case to people where the patient had a high INR and mild derangement in liver function test, and all of the people sitting in the meeting, in the clinical meeting, said it fulfills criteria for transplant. And it turned out to be a high. I said I'd be very suspicious about it because the patient was sick in ICU and it was a DIC. It was not a liver failure at all. That patient was not, it was ventilated and therefore they could not assess encephalopathy. And that is why high INR without encephalopathy is a very dangerous indication for transplant. In the pediatric setting, they still transplant because it's very difficult to assess encephalopathy in children. So high INR becomes an indication. There is a huge danger that if you transplant for high INR without much derangement in liver function test and encephalopathy, that you may be transplanting somebody who doesn't have liver failure. You have to be very careful.
I just want to add one point, sir. Basically, in rat oil poisoning, it's the concept is the VWF dysfunction, and that is the reason for high INR, and they are quite coagulopathic, even though they are not encephalopathic. So this is where plasmapheresis acts, because fresh frozen plasma has a high content of VWF. So this is what Dr. Eapen also keeps advocating in toxic hepatitis and rat oil induced toxic hepatitis. So they're not actually liver failure. They're basically VWF dysfunction, which manifests as raised INR and coagulopathy. So if the patients do not have encephalopathy, they just have some raised liver and transaminitis and INR, I think we should try with plasmapheresis. And suppose they're not going into encephalopathy or they're not fulfilling criteria, other than high INR, we can still wait because they do have a chance of turning back.
Absolutely, Chandan. I mean, it's something which Prof has very beautifully brought out, and what you said. I mean, we need to look at, if you look at only one value of INR, which is above 6.5, you need to be very suspicious of it. And then, you need to assess the patient as a whole rather than just looking at values per se. Any other questions in the audience? We've been at it for an hour and a half now.
Shruti, you have any comment to make or any question to ask, Shruti?
Ashwin.
So nice talks. If one of the speakers can also talk a bit on ATT-induced ALF, because it's very common in Indian scenario. Ashwin sir, Dr. Chandan, whoever.
Chandan, you want to take that as a hepatologist? I'm sure you see more of it than a surgeon we do.
As Ashwin has said, as Vasant has said, the drug-induced liver failure has a poor outcome compared to paracetamol poisoning or hepatitis B-related ALF or hepatitis A-related ALF. So ATT-induced ALF, they, especially in our population, they're a large subset of population who eventually need liver transplantation. So those patients who have no pre-existing liver disease and they present as ATT-induced ALF, I think we should follow the same criteria of King's College criteria, and we should not worry about the tuberculosis part, because post-transplant we can still give them category 1 ATT. So the management remains the same in these patients also. So the criteria should be the same, and they should be triads in the same way and given the same priority as any other cause of ALF. And because the chance of spontaneous recovery in them is definitely less compared to, and they usually do not present as hyperacute. They present more as acute or late acute.
Can I add something to this? There's commonly this view that a patient who's got active tuberculosis is a contraindication for transplant. They have to have a period of treatment with ATT, particularly the subacute liver failures. And I think if the patient won't survive a period of treatment with ATT, they should be offered transplantation, because there are many antituberculous treatments available. And the example, this is a common problem when patients are coming with decompensated liver disease and they've got ATT. There is also this confusion whether the ascites is due to tuberculosis or because there have been instances when we start anti-tuberculous treatment, the ascites actually disappears and the patients are far better. But they're usually also cirrhotics. So if they really have a serious decompensated liver disease, I don't think you should demand that they have to have a period of treatment with ATT for transplantation. The very simple fact, the reason I always give is, if we are prepared to treat patients with acute liver failure, drug-induced acute liver failure following ATT treatment, and usually these people have had less than 2 to 3 weeks of ATT treatment, there is no reason why you can't offer the same for chronic liver disease as well. We can offer to ATT, because when we are offering it to acute liver failure, you're going to treat them post-transplant with antituberculous therapy. And it's much easier to treat them post-transplant than it is really when they've got decompensated liver disease. So active tuberculosis should not represent a contraindication for transplant.
Thank you.
Prathapan, you have any comment to make in Calicut? Yeah, Ashwin, back to you.
Okay, and we have had another very exciting and scintillating session with Prof giving his views, which are actually the if you ask me, the icing on the cake.
Dr. Uday wants to ask a question. Uday?
Yeah, I'm there. Ashwin, will you permit me?
Yeah, please go for it.
This is for Dr. Chandan. As I said, it was a fantastic talk. This question is in scenario of ACLF. My question is, in ACLF patient, does the etiology of background liver disease like cirrhosis, will it affect the outcomes? Like suppose we have alcoholic patients abstinent from 10 days, recently diagnosed hepatitis B with high viral load, hepatitis C with very high viral load. Will that affect the outcomes in ACLF, sir?
Thank you, Uday, for the kind words. It's a very good question what you have asked. In my slide on the UNOS database, I had said that those who had presented with ACLF 2 or 3, that advanced ACLF, the proportion of patients in them were alcohol related. And if you see the data, different case series of outcomes of transplantation, especially from East Asia and all that, China, Taiwan, it's mainly hepatitis B ACLF. So hepatitis B reactivation induced ACLF have very good prognosis, and most of them usually present as ACLF 0 or 1, and they do get away without transplantation. But those patients who have underlying NASH cirrhosis or underlying alcohol cirrhosis, who present with acute insult like alcoholic hepatitis or hepatitis A or hepatitis E or drug-induced liver injury, very importantly, these patients usually have a poor prognosis. They present with much advanced course of disease, ACLF 2 or 3 with more organ failures, and they are the ones who actually need to be considered for liver transplantation.
Okay, thank you, sir. I got it.
If we have no further questions, then I think we'll end.
Prathapan wants to say something.
Dr. Prathapan.
I have only one thing to ask. In patients who are having acute infections like cellulitis or other non-gastrointestinal infections, they may also get worsening. Sometimes they may not be recoverable as well. Is there any indication for doing early liver transplantation in those situations? Or shall we leave them to succumb?
Chandan, you want to take that?
That's a very good question, sir. That is what I had said, the difference between APSL definition and EASL definition. Because EASL says any precipitant, even sepsis also presenting as organ failures in a case of cirrhosis is ACLF, because they have high short-term mortality. So if a patient has come with ACLF with organ failures, the most important criteria is organ failures definition, defining organ failures at baseline and day 3 to day 7. If they have organ failures, whatever be the precipitant, and in spite of medical supports, the ACLF is not improving, then they should be considered for liver transplantation.
I have a question to the Vasant. You said you have the option of doing APOLT in acute liver failure. So if you use that policy in most of the patients, you can actually avoid the need for long-term immunosuppression. So in which condition you selectively look for APOLT as not with the standard living donor liver transplant approach?
Yes, there are certain specific indications to select the patient for APOLT, because patient selection is very important in APOLT. So you should look for liver regeneration. It should be done in hyperacute conditions like viral hepatitis, paracetamol poisoning, or toxic injury related to mushroom poisoning, because you get a rapid recovery. In those patients, it's indicated. Not in subacute patients where there is no regeneration at all, where there is no possibility of regeneration or very less regeneration. So APOLT patients are selective patients, and it is not offered to every patient of ALS.
But the idea seems to be very good, because there is no reason to continue long term.
The idea of APOLT is, the first thing is rapid recovery of the patient. Because you give a graft, you give a partial graft, so the native liver is there. It tide over the crisis of toxic hepatocyte dropout, complete dropout. So it increases the rapid recovery of the patient, first thing. Second, the major advantage is the patient can be without immunosuppression once the native liver regenerates, because it can be a bridge to complete native regeneration. That's the second important thing. And the only disadvantage as such, which was explained previously, was the increased technical complications. But with recent surgical expertise and increased advancement of with expert centers, the morbidity and mortality has come down significantly, and 2/3 of the patients can be immunosuppression free after few years. So we gradually taper the immunosuppression after 6 months, and after confirming the graft regeneration, we slowly withdraw the immunosuppression so that the graft will, shrink.
To answer your question and to add just another point to what Dr. Vasant has said, we would look at young patients, hyperacute liver failures, and certain etiologies. I mean, these would be the three main things where we would look at UPHOLD. Of course, you need to understand that UPHOLD involves a partial hepatectomy in a toxic liver. So the patient would need to be stable, intraoperatively. To sort of withstand that partial hepatectomy. So even though we would like to offer it in more number of patients, and you would have other constraints like hemodynamics, those of space, especially when they're very young, but that is more so for metabolic liver disease. But so you would have other constraints as well. Prof, would you like to add anything?
Not really. I wonder if he was asking whether was he talking about outside acute liver failure as well for a
No. He was
ALF,
asking
because there is a chance of recovery of natural liver.
Why we don't do UPHOLD in all ALF?
No, that's not the question he was asking. Prathapan, can you
No, sir. My question is, my question is, if you have the option of UPHOLD in most of the acute liver failure, we have we don't have to continue immunosuppression for long time. So why don't we consider UPHOLD in most patients in selected cases? That is what my question was.
No. I think as much as possible we should be thinking about UPHOLD actually. Even I believe even in the subacute variety where there is not regeneration, I've been pushing that, because even in the subacute variety over a period of time, the liver will regenerate. It's only when you've got some fibrosis in the native liver, or when things like autoimmune liver disease, they may not regenerate. But if they don't regenerate and the liver becomes they will atrophy over a period of time. You don't have to stop immunosuppression. So you can always start off with UPHOLD anyway in those patients. I think whenever possible, one should be thinking about UPHOLD, is my view, in acute liver failure. Even if it doesn't regenerate, it doesn't matter, because Vasant kept saying we can withdraw immunosuppression in 2/3 of the patients. So we're not withdrawing immunosuppression in 1/3 of the patients. So it doesn't matter if you can do UPHOLD in these patients. I think you're right. We should try as much as possible to do UPHOLD in as many patients as possible to do. I mean, if they are very unstable, you want to do a very quick operation. I don't think your operation should increase mortality. As long as you're careful about that, that's okay.
There's the Dr. RVSS. I don't know who's that. Wants to ask something? RVSS. Yeah, Ashwin, back.
Okay, sir. And another session which has run close to 2 hours. Again, very exciting, very educational, with Prof giving his viewpoints. So I'll close the session here. We'll meet again in a week's time with another topic with a new set of speakers.
So again, on behalf of LGS, I thank Ashwin and especially Professor Rela to be there and add luster to the whole discussion. Thank you all again. We'll see you next week with another exciting session. Ashwin, thank you. Thanks. Good night to everyone.
Prof, thank you.